Great. Well, again, welcome and good morning. The room is even fuller, which is wonderful. And as we were thinking about who we could have to really kick off this day with this expanded group of amazing after-school practitioners, I turned to two of my personal heroes. And so I'm glad, yes, Stephanie. So I'm glad that I can have them both with you just to share. This is really going to be a conversation. So I'm going to ask both of them a couple of questions and give them 5 to 7 minutes to explain to you the great work they've been doing. And then we'll really have mics and going around so that you can really ask your questions and dig in to their wisdom. So we have Stephanie Jones with us from Harvard. Stephanie is amazing. There really isn't any other word that I would use to describe her. You may say, why did I bring someone from the Harvard Graduate School of Education here to talk to practitioners? It's because as long as I've followed her work, she really has had the basic goal of making sure that the folks who work directly with young people have the best of what we know from research packaged in a way that they can use it in the easiest way. So I couldn't think of a better person to have with us. She's just finished some amazing work for the Wallace Foundation, looking across how many?
25.
25 curricula, social emotional learning curricula for elementary school students, and doing this wonderful job of deconstructing them so that we really can not just look at them and say, why don't we use X or Y, but what do they really do for us? What are the activities that they support? What specific skills do they build? What kind of support do they provide to practitioners? And now she's pushed what she's going to talk about today, pushed that even further to really sort of go with the red herring in the room, which is when we bring curricula into schools or into youth programs, we talk about this big word of fidelity, but the likelihood is that they don't really get used fully. And so you don't get the impact that you would get if you had really done everything that was done in the research study. So what can we do about that? Stephanie's come up with this wonderful idea of kernels. And so I'm going to hand the clicker over to you. I'll get it started. And hand the clicker over so you can go forth.
Thank you.
Can you see that well enough down there to see which slide you're on? Okay, good.
More or less. Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be called a hero by you because you are a hero of mine. So I am a developmental psychologist by training, and I work primarily in the area of social, emotional, and behavioral development. And our work has been situated in research, but in maybe the last decade, we've shifted toward translational work, trying to unpack research for practical application of different types. And what we're really interested in doing is what I'm going to show you today very briefly, and that is sort of getting underneath the hood of SEL. And we do that in two ways. The first is this way. So as many of you know, as everybody knows, there's a lot packed into the umbrella. There are lots of frameworks, there are lots of ideas, there are lots of organizational systems that help us understand what's important. And it's difficult with all of that out there to navigate and understand what's important. So one body of work that we're focused on is trying to distill from across a variety of frameworks. Character development frameworks, positive youth development frameworks, SEL frameworks, all of the anti-bullying frameworks, to sort of see what's common and what's different. And we call that the taxonomy project. The visual illustrations that we're creating while we do this project are little snapshots up there. But essentially, our idea is to say, if we looked closely at all the frameworks, what would we see as truly the same, even if things are called different names? And what would we see is truly different, even if things are called the same name? So we're trying to get underneath the hood to distill the what of SEL, that broad field. And then the second part of our work is really to get underneath the hood and describe the how of SEL. And this gets to the project that we did with the Wallace Foundation, which is to look deeply inside 25 evidence-based SEL programs for elementary school, 3 of which were designed for after-school programs. And our idea is that if we looked closely, we would find that there are common elements, that there are, even if they have different characters associated with them, they have different ways of doing them, there are common features that are strategies that exist across all of these 25 programs. We call these kernels. And what we'd like to do is identify kernels, pull them out, design them, and share them. So I just said all of this. We'd like to identify common denominators of practice and share them with the world. Let's see. So to break that idea down a little bit further, these are all evidence-based SEL programs. And when you look across them, for example, all 25, including this subset, have routines to support young people to engage in physiological regulation. So to stop, calm down, and make a choice. They all have that routine. They all do them differently. But that, to me, suggests a kernel of practice concept that could be adopted and implemented in ways that make sense in local contexts and might be what accounts for the effectiveness of these kinds of programs. So why are we interested in developing these kernels? One reason is what Karen suggested, and that is that most comprehensive evidence-based boxes or packages for SEL are hard to implement. They're hard to adopt. They're hard to implement in the ways that they are designed just for lots of good reasons. And our sense is that if we pulled apart SEL programs and shared kernels, not only would we be handing over choice to those who are doing the implementation, they would be selecting what they want to do based on their local population. We'd be identifying also a set of strategies that can bridge context, so they can go from elementary school to out-of-school time programs to home. So they are very portable and deployable. They're by design, easy to do, evocative and interesting, and highly resonant with what's needed in the classroom. So just one example from our work, we've been working on a set of games that are designed to support young children's executive function and self-regulation, for example. And this is just a set of games. The thing is not that it's the games that are important. It's that the games are an opportunity for adults and young children to engage in something fun together, to work on a specific skill that is shared, and then to have a conversation about what happened. So it's about building a specific skill, but it's also about building a connection and a relationship. And this is what they look like. There are lots of other examples of this. I'd be happy to share them. Thank you. Oh, and here, we've written a brief about this idea, and it's on the Wallace Foundation website. It describes everything I've just said and our process for distilling kernels.
Great. So one quick question before I hand it over to Keith, and you just said a lot of amazing things. So you've got folks in the room, a huge number of them, in fact, that are sort of familiar with and using the youth program quality assessment and the methods, and they know the pyramid. And so when you think about looking at the pyramid and looking at sort of safe and seeing welcoming activities, and going in to sort of get training on understanding why welcoming activities are important and what are some range of things you can do. How does that concept of breaking sort of what we need to do to make sure we have sort of safe, supportive, engaging environments, how does that concept relate to kernels?
I see it as completely related. So having a welcoming activity or a welcoming routine or anything like that, the activity itself, in my mind, represents a kernel strategy. The thing about it is and this is what we're working on, is to figure out what about it has to happen and what about it can be adapted to fit any particular setting. And my sense from something like a welcoming activity is that one core feature of it is that not only is there a connection made and some sort of sense communicated of belonging and welcome, there has to be a sense communicated that I know you and I really am happy that you're here. So how that happens can vary. That part of it is the essential part, right? So the kernels idea is about distilling what what's the essential part that has to happen, and we can do it in lots of different ways that make sense to us, that we create.
That's such good common sense. We often talk about footnoting common sense at the forum, and you've done more than footnote it. You've like completely dug in, sort of analyzed it, and then given it back to us in very great ways. I'm going to hand this over to Keith. I don't know how many decades I've known you, Keith, but it's more than 2. And Keith is another of my heroes because Keith began working with what we would now call opportunity youth, what we used to call vulnerable young people, disconnected youth. We had other terms, but really sort of started youth communication as a way to make sure young people had voice, literally had voice, had opportunities to heal by thinking about their stories, writing their stories, really sort of getting their stories up to be quality, that they were journalistic quality stories, so if they wanted to share them, they could, and then ran a series of youth communications vehicles, newsletters, magazines, et cetera. I'll let him tell you the rest of the story, but Stephanie, when you were just saying this idea of what you're really looking for when those brain games, for example, is an opportunity for young people and adults to come together, to do an activity together in which there's relationship building, they're learning something, doing something together, and then they get to talk about it. I mean, I think that's in some ways the essence of what you tried to decide to do with this wealth of stories that you had. So tell us the journey that you've been on with Youth Stories.
Okay, so I think I'm a case study for Stephanie's work in some ways. And I'll explain that in a second. So youth communication uses a story-based approach, that is stories by young people themselves, to help staff connect to young people and help them strengthen the social and emotional skills and literacy skills that will help young people become successful. And before I tell you about that, I want to show you by reading just a few sentences from the story what we mean, what the power, and you'll see in these few sentences the power of a story by a young person. And then I'll talk about how that works. So this story is in a middle school social and emotional learning curriculum that we've developed. And the backstory, which I'm not going to read at the beginning of it, it's by a boy named Shatik Palmer, and it's called Explaining My Life. Shatik went into foster care as a child, kinship care with his grandmother. His grandmother died when he was 9, and he was placed in several different settings. And the trauma of the multiple losses and these poor placements caused him to go wild. And he wrote, I began to fight, disobey my foster parents, do badly in school. I didn't want to listen to anybody because I felt alone in the world, like I was the only one going through problems. But writing made me less mad at the world. When I got mad at something or someone, I would walk away. The moment I got home, I would write about it. Like all teenage kids, I did get into a little trouble, but not as much trouble as I got into before. Writing also helped me with counseling. It got me communicating with my therapist. We started to talk more about how I was feeling. And then he ends, now I'm 15 when he was writing this story, and partly because of writing, I can control my emotions better. When I was 9, I didn't understand where all that anger was coming from and why I got in so much trouble. But when I look back at it now, I'm like, wow, that kid went through a lot. By writing, I forgive the 9-year-old Shatik. So, I'm not going to say it, but think about what's the social and emotional learning strategy that Shatik is using there. Hold that thought, we'll come to it. So we now, Youth Communication Now, today publishes curricula on social and emotional learning. These are some of them: middle school, high school, social and emotional learning, gender, career readiness. But it was a painful process to get to that point. I'm going to very briefly tell you about it. We've been around 38 years. For 32 of those years, we were a youth media program, not a social and emotional learning and professional services program. We had young people come to our office, youth in foster care, homeless youth, youth with juvenile justice contact, youth who've suffered trauma, write about important stories, and we published those stories in magazines that were distributed by roughly 1,000 adults through the New York City systems where young people are, and left in public places, and young people picked them up and read them. And as social media blew up around 2012 or so, so did our model. young people were not picking up the magazines in the way that they used to. And so we had a meeting and with our board, and we said, well, maybe we should go out of business. It's been a good run, but if our main goal of writing stories in which young people inspire their peers to change and show them how to do it isn't working because we can't deliver it to them, what's the point? And we decided, well, okay, maybe we should. But then first, let's go talk with some of those adults who are distributing the stories and see what they have to say. And what we learned, of course, was that yes, young people aren't picking them up, but a subset of those adults had begun using the stories in formal instruction, in youth programs and in out-of-school programs. And they said that when they did that, the stories were just as engaging and compelling as they were to young people when they read them on their own. So we asked, well, why don't you do more of that? And they said, we don't know how. We need lessons, we need professional development, we need support to be able to do that. So we said, oh, well, we can do that naively, but that's not so easy. So we spent the next 2 years doing two things. Well, doing one thing, trying to figure out what was the alignment between the research in youth development and social and emotional learning in these areas and what young people were saying was their experience and how they were managing their lives. So the first thing we did is we read all the research, and here it is, and a lot more. So we looked at all this stuff. I'm not going to belabor it. But where we landed was the closest alignment between what we saw young people writing about and what we saw in the research was the CASEL social and emotional competencies. As soon as we focused on those competencies, it was like, you know when you learn a new word and you start to see that word everywhere? When we really focused on those competencies and we started looking at these stories, we said, oh my God, Shatik is using a self-management strategy. That's writing to control his emotions and achieve his goals. And over and over and over again, we saw this. So we decided we would adopt the CASEL framework for our curricula. Common Core literacy fits easily within our work. It's literacy-based. I won't go into that. But the other thing that we looked at, we really very much liked the University of Chicago's Foundations for Young Adult Success, which Karen talked about yesterday. The whole developmental approach, but within that, the thing that stood out the most for us was this concept of agency, because agency, that is young people's sense of my actions make a difference, and if I take action, I can improve my life. That's the motor that drives all of the other change. So we landed there, and so now we have, if you will, and we've done this a long time, we have 5,000 stories in a database. And now we're going to create curricula. So what are the criteria we're going to use to select those stories? And so the first one was, do the writers model the social and emotional learning competencies? So we were able to go through and Shatik, bingo, self-regulation strategy. And then we find self-awareness and self-management and responsible decision-making over and over and over again. And then within that, if it's a middle school curriculum, you want to have stories on bullying and peers and family and violence and all those kinds of things. So you pick the subject, you find the social emotional competency, which is almost a kernel, and you've got your curriculum built. We did the same thing for the professional development and the lesson writing. I won't go into the details on that unless Karen wants to ask, but I would just like to finish by pointing out kernels was a new word for me a month ago or 2 months ago. And so I went back and started looking at these stories, saying, okay, where are kernels? Where are these, I think as these specific behaviors that can be taught quickly is one of your definitions. Yeah. And I saw, okay, in one of our stories, in Shatik's story, there's journaling, there's reflective writing. That's a specific behavior that can be taught quickly as a self-management strategy. If you look through our stories, there's walking in nature as a strategy that somebody used. There's seeking help. There's connecting long-term goals to immediate actions. If you look at another domain, social awareness and relationship skills, you see teens using apologizing, making friends across racial boundaries, speaking up in relationships. All of these kernels, if you will, these moves that young people can make are embedded in the stories. And though we didn't know the term, we pulled them out in all the lessons. So I think I'll finish with that.
Great, wonderful. So now we want to make sure you can see their faces as opposed to their slides. So the slide part's over, so we'll let you see them. And Keith, before we open up, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions, so start to get your questions ready. Folks with the mics, get ready. We're going to chat for about 5 more minutes and then have time for questions. And we should have about 20 minutes for questions. So one of the things that I was struck by, Keith, as you've been talking about how you've been bringing this into adults, and you said very quickly, adults don't know how. I wonder if you could share the story of what it looked like and what it felt like when you were able to bring this into, I believe it was a set of probation officers.
Yeah.
Just share that story.
Sure. So we tested a lot of these programs before we put them into the curriculum. And so one of our beta tests was we were asked to train all of New York City's juvenile probation officers. There are about 30 of them. And we were training them on a positive masculinity curriculum. And so we went in to do the training, and the first thing that happened was the officers were extremely, I would have to say, belligerent. They were like, books, how come we're not using books? We don't even read books ourselves. You know, this is ridiculous. So anyway, but we had to do the training. So we did it, and we trained them in a lot of these kernels, if you will, active listening, open-ended questions, which in a system that is predicated on control and compliance, let's just say we weren't heard very well in this training. But they had to do it. It is a control and compliance situation. So the officers implemented the program for 6 months, and we went back and did a focus group with them. And I was expecting to get shellacked by these guys. But when we got there, I opened it up. I said, "How did it go?" And the first officer said, "This is the best thing we've ever used." And I said, "Oh, that's surprising. Why is that?" And they said, "Well, when we brought in the stories and read them with the young people, they opened up and began to talk to us, and we could do our job." And as I heard them talk, I realized, so we had trained them in asking open-ended questions. It went in one ear, out the other. But in the curriculum, these questions are scripted in, open-ended in the stories. So they would read up to a certain point, and they'd ask the question. And I wish I had been a fly on the wall, because I could have seen the kids go, "Did he really ask that?" And then he asked it again 3 paragraphs later and 3 paragraphs later. And it changed the dynamic from control and compliance to we're in this together trying to figure out solutions to the problems that you're facing. There are all kinds of things that we asked them. I mean, you may even remember some, I don't remember from our conversation, but we asked, well, what other changes did you see? And they said, well, the boys became more helpful. They would bring the snacks to the room. No one had ever done that before. And then one officer, last little anecdote, they had done the program for 10 weeks in one of the groups, and it was a stable cohort group, and had been going very well. The officer had been completely surprised by how the boys were beginning to open up and really talk about the issues in their lives. And he goes to start, and a new boy had joined the group that week, and he goes to start the session, and nobody will talk. And he's thinking to himself, he said, "Did something happen in the news that I missed that's setting these guys off? Like, what's going on here?" And he tries to start again, and nobody will talk. And so then he has the presence of mind to ask them instead of forcing them, what, is there something going on? And one of the boys said to him, "Is he, the new boy, going to be here for the rest of the sessions, or is he just here today? Because if he's just here today, we can't talk the way we've been talking." So using the stories and changing the way in which these officers interacted with the boys opened them up in a way that allowed them to really begin to deal with the issues in their lives that they became, even the boys became self-aware of, because instead of acting out, which is what they would have done prior to that, enough self-awareness had been generated in that time that they could address their discomfort to the group.
Great, wonderful.
Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
This is a conversation.
what I love about that, about the set of stories you just told, is that while it's complex, it's not simplistic, but it's simple. There's something elegant about it, about this core idea of just asking a question, right? but having a scaffold for doing it, because they weren't ready to do it without the stories as a scaffold. But the magic is in the question, just opening up to that young person and letting them give you their view. Like, that's just so elegant. And I love it. That's all I want to say.
Well, I mean, I think, for both of you, what's elegant, and you've done parallel things in very different, starting with very different types of raw data. You're starting with evidence-based curriculum. You're starting with 5,000 stories, but going through to really figure out what the essence is in here, how we can, create taxonomies of it, and then how do we bring it to adult practitioners in a way that they can use. So, Stephanie, before we open it up, I'm just curious, are you far enough along in the kernels work that you can talk about the difference in receptivity to a curriculum versus kernels?
In a sense. We're doing a project right now where we are distilling from the data we gathered in our review of those 25 programs. So we're looking across all of those programs, and we're saying, for a key skill like social problem solving for third graders, what are all the strategies that are coded as being tied to social problem solving for third graders across all these programs? And when you do something like that, what you find is you have about 400 different strategies. But those 400 different strategies actually, when you look closely at them, really boil down to about 5. 5 essential ways of doing social problem solving work with kids in the middle of elementary school. And so that's the process that we're engaged in right now. And what we found as we've talked about this idea is, I guess, 2 things. We hear, on the one hand, some level of pushback from those who have developed and are sharing programs, more comprehensive programs. So that's something we definitely hear. And the pushback is, but you really have to do these things in this way because the evidence is based on doing it only in this way. So that's one thing that I can talk a little bit more about in a minute. I'll tell you my feelings about that. And on the other hand, we hear from everybody, we don't want to do a program. We don't want to have someone tell us that we have to do this box, that we want a little bit more ownership over what we do and how we do it in a manner that fits our kids, because we know our kids. So, so we hear lots of enthusiasm about it. We're in the process of sort of figuring out a little bit more about what the idea is. So we had this idea, and in the process of building kernels or identifying them, we're continuing to figure out what we actually mean by it. So it's not completely formulated yet, but we're happy to share anything that we've figured out with anybody who's interested.
All right, well, we don't see very well out there, but I'm assuming that there are folks out there that have questions, and so I'm going to let the folks that have the mics tell us when there is someone that has a question. But, sitting here as someone who, and obviously the whole Weichert Center staff and group of consultants are here with us, as well as the folks from Primetime who have been using this work in amazing ways. But the underlying piece behind this, I think, which is just so important and refreshing, is that the goal is to empower practitioners to use things that have been tested in ways that make sense, but in ways that give them the flexibility to understand the context in which you're using them. So with that as just the sort of the opening, that's why these 2 folks are on the stage with me today. And that's why, obviously, 10 years ago plus, we decided that the work that was happening at High Scope with the youth program quality assessment and the methods was so important that it needed to grow and expand. So let's see if there are questions and comments out there.
There's one over there.
And can you stand up so we can sort of see you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Patrick from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Stephanie, you teased us, so I want you to, I'll just give you the softball. Tell us about your feelings about doing things in a certain order or not. So,
Okay. So This is what
I think we kind of can tell their feelings here.
Is this being recorded? Okay, I don't care. I actually think that there needs to be an array of options available, right? That there is a continuum of options. That on one end of the continuum is something that is a box that can be adopted whole cloth by a district or a place or anybody and implemented in the way, ideally, that it was designed to be implemented and the way that it was tested. From there, I think there should be additional options, meaning that there should be some way to use those comprehensive packages flexibly, and there should be strategies that have been tested as strategies. Those should be available too. My hypothesis about the comprehensive packages, which when you test them, so there are lots of programs out there. There's a smaller set that have been tested using randomized control trials. When you look at the evidence from those randomized control trials from that smaller set, you basically see the same findings, right? So they're all effective in largely the same way to a relatively small degree. So we want them to be more effective than I think we're seeing, but they are effective. My hunch is that if you looked inside those programs and pulled out their common elements, it's the common elements that account for their effects, not the whole thing. And that's the hypothesis. I have no idea if it's true or not. To test that hypothesis, you could do really complicated, expensive research, or you could pull out the common elements and try them as common elements, right? And that's what we're doing. That's our approach to it. I think it's an open question. My feeling is that in order to make what's so powerful potentially about evidence-based SEL work available to more and more resonant with those who are actually doing the work, there has to be more available to do.
Let me jump in and give a footnote to that analysis, which I agree with 100%. And someone yesterday is in the hall as we were walking around said, why don't we have more folks here from juvenile justice? So next year we will try to get more folks here from juvenile justice and child welfare. This is always a growing and expanding group. But one way we could do that is actually to bring someone for Mark Lipsey's team. And so there's a process that's been done on the juvenile justice side that ended up with something called SPEP, Standard Program Evaluation Protocol. But they did the same thing, and Mark's at Vanderbilt University, they did the same thing that Stephanie did sort of on steroids. They took like 900 evidence-based programs in juvenile justice, and they pulled them apart in the same way that Stephanie pulled them apart and started to sort them. And these are both branded programs, but also, sort of homegrown programs that didn't have a brand on them, but they had the right kind of evaluation. And what they did was to basically say, first of all, let's sort them by philosophy. Some of these philosophies just don't work. Throw them away. All the scared straight stuff, it just didn't work. So we're going to put that over here in a box and say, don't do that. Whatever people do, don't buy that. Now let's take the ones that work and that are all basically have some kind of an asset philosophy underlying them. Let's take those and let's now look at what the components are. What are they actually, what's the program model they're trying to do? Is it a counseling model? Is it a skill building model? Is it a family therapy model? What is it that they're actually bringing in? So they sorted them. And then they did the analysis that Stephanie did inside of those categories. How effective were they, which ones? And what they found was that, as you said, the branded ones sometimes were slightly more effective, but not always. So that was sort of one clue that you can do these things at home and get to almost the same level of effectiveness, and sometimes a higher level of effectiveness than the ones that have been sort of branded and packaged and sold. But then the thing that they did after that, which again was in this, how do we empower practitioners and systems to use the work, is they dug in even further inside of each of those models and said, well, what's really going on here? What made this work? Was it dosage? Was it the right match between the risk level of the young people and the intensity of whatever the intervention was? Was it the staff training? What things seem to actually make this effective? And then they brought that research into providers and said, what we want you to do is analyze your system. What are you trying to do? Are you doing counseling? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? If you are, then pull out the standards and find out if the way you're doing it, if you're doing it but you're not using a high enough dosage, if you're doing it but you've mismatched it to the risk level of the kid, you probably aren't going to get the effect that you want. And so they basically made a diagnostic tool out of it that let people use the research to diagnose what they were already doing and then go over to a set of program components to do it better. Those are the kind of things we're going to keep trying to bring you in this practice space, because our basic philosophy is you actually do know what you're trying to do. You definitely want to do it better, but you want respectful ways for people to bring research in to help you. So, more questions out there? Over there, waving, yes. Hi.
Hi, my name's Katie Brackenridge, and I'm really excited about this kernels work. We work with districts and their after-school partners to try to get them to be more consistent about practices across both those spaces. So the idea that you could pick 5 practices and we're going to do these across all spaces sounds great. My concern and my question are that once you have figured out what some of these kernels are, that this becomes another program.
Yeah.
So people say, I'm doing the kernels. And so I'm curious of what you've thought about different ways of marketing this or presenting this that helps people to understand a little bit about what Karen was just saying about the flexibility within this.
Yeah, so I totally hear the concern, and I 1,000% agree with you. It's the same problem in our taxonomy work, which is that in distilling the core idea of what is important in SEL, we're creating another framework for it, which is something we don't want to do. So we really don't want to create another program that just is a variant of other things, but it's called kernels. And I think the way to avoid doing that is to do something like what Karen just described, which is to really be very clear about 2 things. And each of the things has multiple things in it, so forgive me. One thing is to figure out what the essence is. So to go back to where we started, what is the essence of this kernel? Is the essence about building a relationship? And what is the vehicle for doing that? The vehicle might be having a conversation about emotions, but it's the conversation, not necessarily the emotions, that is key. So I think if we can get to the essence, like what the kernel is really about, then I think that communicates something different than here's a strategy for building emotion knowledge, right? Those two have a different, they can be the same, right? Here's a strategy for building emotion knowledge, but its essence is to do this in this way. I think that that communicates something different than just having a bunch of strategies lined up. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, and this kind of goes back to what Keith was saying about the open-ended questions. It's about having really close alignment between a specific skill, competency, attitude, attribute that's being built and the strategy. That often what I've found in SEL is that it's hard to see exactly what the thing is trying to do. Like, what is it actually building specifically? Are they really closely aligned? And open-ended questions in that context with stories as a scaffold is very closely aligned with that age, with a key developmental task of that age group, which is sort of building identity and having agency and sharing information. So I think the second part to avoiding some of the programminess of this is to just really show this competency and this action are closely tied together. And so it's not just a disconnected set of things. I don't know. We're going to find out.
Jump in.
I mean, I think this kernels idea is very powerful, I think. And I think it's not just as kernels, but as a framing notion for how do we think about the work that we do. And I think I'm responding to Katie's question a little bit, which is that in New York, when we work with tons of programs, and they have the same problem. Can they integrate us? Can they strip out a little part of it? How are they going to use it? And so that we work with environmental programs and theater programs and dance programs and all these different modalities, right? And I think, when I hear kernels, I think professional development. I think people are doing what they're doing, and often they could be doing it better. And if through professional development we create a notion in the field that we should really be looking at what does the research suggest time and time again seems to work. And if whether I'm running a dance program or a farm or an environmental program or a juvenile justice program, whatever it is, I've basically got my program in place, and it may or may not be some evidence-based program, but I'm not running it the way they wanted me to anyway because I've adapted it. But if the notion of a kernel becomes part of our professional development, we need to say, every day I'm making a choice. I should make the better choice each time, use the better kernel. It's not like, it's responsive to the way in which the work is really working in the field, is how it feels to me. It's not creating new programs, but it's enhancing the programs that people are doing.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Pernisha Clifton, and my question is for Keith. I really like the magazine approach with getting the kids' stories and voices out. And I was just wondering if there was an intentional multilingual or multicultural approach to getting these stories so that kids of various backgrounds were actually included in the magazine. And when I say get their authentic voice, were they able to express in their native tongue? Or if their English wasn't as strong, were they able to write in the form of English in which they understood?
The first part was multicultural, the second part was literacy level?
Or if so multicultural and then literacy level, and were they able to write in other than English if they weren't English speakers?
Okay, so yeah, the advantage of being in New York is that you can't help being multicultural, but we also are very, if you will, culturally competent in the program. So students write all the time, either explicitly or implicitly from their cultural backgrounds. I didn't read an excerpt here from that I was planning to, but it's a story by a Dominican boy who comes to America, has poor language skills, and like many immigrants, focuses on math instead of language, gets very good at math. Kids start asking him to cheat for him in their math classes, and he goes from cheater to tutor. But there's one example. But there are countless. So yeah, and we do in selecting the stories for the curricula, because we have so many now. We have, we'll have 8 stories on being an ally or on gender issues or something like that. So we select from a wide range of backgrounds. So these are richly multicultural. Yes, we do. One of our feeder programs to our writing program is the international high schools in New York City. Some of those kids come in with pretty good skills, some do not. And so we have staff from time to time who have various language skills. So yes, writers do sometimes write in their home language, at least for their first couple stories, and then it gets translated and then published. And sometimes on the website comes up in the home language.
And do you code your stories explicitly, or in the story itself, is it clear what the racial, ethnic, cultural background of the young person is?
You can make your guess from the names. One thing, I've taught a lot of these stories and the testing of them, and one thing I tested too, I tested a lot of different little parts, kernels, if you will. And one of the kernels I tested was having a photograph of the writer and not having a photograph of the writer. And I thought the photograph in a way would be good because there would be this identification. But I found out that on balance, that was not what I wanted to do, because kids of all backgrounds could project themselves more easily onto the experience of this writer when they didn't see when they weren't making that immediate assumption about either the race or the gender or the hairstyle or anything that could throw them off in the photo. We wanted to. The stories have been so carefully constructed through 10 or 15 drafts that we didn't want to. It turned out that the actual photograph was a distraction.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Latricia. I was curious to discover if you wrote kernels or story-based learning for the adults, for the adult SEL acquisition.
So, excuse me. I made it through the whole winter without a cold, and now that it's not winter anymore. So I have a lot. I think that let me think about what I'm going to say. I think that the work we're actually doing includes kernels that are about adult strategies and practices that support classroom management and things that adults do that are sort of distinct from direct skill building with kids. So they definitely include that. I see the kernels as a kind of indirect way, even if they're really focused on specific strategies to build skills with kids, as an indirect way to supporting adults' own development competencies, because they're evocative and they're an opportunity for adults to practice the work that they're doing with kids. And if they work the way we're thinking about them, they should be adapted by adults to suit their own way of doing the work and their setting. So it pulls the adult into the work, but doesn't make it hard. So I mean, this is where we're going with it. So that's part of our idea. And I think that what's been left out in SEL for a long time, and it's really, in the last 5 years been made more explicit, is the direct work with adults. I mean, we were just having a conversation before we started, which is essentially about if we just worked with adults, would we actually be doing any direct work with kids? Or, is it really about supporting the adults who are then working directly with kids? So we're designing them to take that seriously and think about it as both a direct and indirect path.
Yes.
Good morning. My name's Jason Patry. I'm from Missouri After School Network. And first of all, I can't express enough my appreciation for the work of both of you this morning. I know a lot of programs.
Can you come around this way a little bit so we can see you past the podium?
Yes. I can't express enough my appreciation for your work because I know that being intentional about social emotional learning can be a very intimidating prospect, be it an individual school, a school district, a network of after school or school day programs. And when you first dive into this, it can probably be taking a sip from a fire hydrant with, as you pointed out, the number of different programs and curriculums and everything like that. My question, and it's either A or B, you could probably take it either way, is it seems like for as many curriculums as there are out there, there's an equal number of ways to measure the impact. And I know that a lot of people or programs struggle with how to effectively determine and quantify those impacts that those programs are having. So my question is either A, what measurement method did you use when you were looking at either these kernels or these stories to try and measure those? What were those key items that you have found? Or, and this may be a bigger can of worms, do you intend to be like phase 2 is, all right, we've distilled down those kernels from effective curriculums. Now, is there something similar, a thread of evaluation that can be examined?
Do you want to start?
Well, very briefly, what we do, we're in an early stage of this, so we're doing two things. One is we try a triangulation approach. So we have self-report surveys, and we ask the adults and we ask the teens, as a result of doing the program, do you feel that you can use your self-awareness better, that sort of thing. And if the adults and the teens are reporting similar results, we have some confidence that that may be happening. At the same time, a lot of and this hasn't happened yet, but a lot of the programs that are using our programs are doing much broader evaluations of sense of well-being in their programs and is attendance increasing and all those, so both self-reports and outcome measures. And so in time, if we get the right settings, we'll be able to see does using the programs have some impact on those kinds of outcomes.
So again, this is one of those big, complicated issues, the issue of measurement and assessment in SEL. It's also very fraught and uncomfortable to talk about at times because of some use of measurement in SEL, perhaps for reasons that maybe they shouldn't be used. So there's lots of tools out there. In our Wallace, in the report we did for Wallace, which is online and free through the Wallace Foundation, when we were coding the programs, we identified whether or not the program had assessment tools embedded in it to keep track of whether or not the use of the program was making a difference for kids using those rubrics. I tend to think that there's a lot out there. It's not perfect, and that going back to kind of first principles for this kind of work is the best way to go with measurement. So for us, that means saying, okay, let's get really clear about the specific skill, competency, attitude, attribute that we are focused on. What does that look like in a kid, in a young child, or in a medium-sized child, or a big child? You know, what would we expect to see if that child was able to do that skill most of the time? What would we really be able to see? And if we could write that down, align it with a particular strategy or practice, and do it in a way that is consistent with how it's supposed to be done, but also adapted to be locally relevant. And then we asked ourselves a little while later, do we see that specific behavior that we identified at the outset? Then I think we have the right alignment and precision to know something about what we're looking for, what we're doing, and what we expect to see in the end. Some measures out there that are designed for research purposes can be deployed in that way. Not all of them, because they aren't really precisely lined up with what we expect kids to be able to do and what we could see them do. So it's a whole big area of work that is on the table for this field, for sure. But I do think we can make progress by just saying, okay, what is it that we expect kids to be able to do, and what will we be able to see them do if they're doing it? And then use that as a rubric.
I think that's a terrific way to sort of tie a bow around the conversation that we've been having. And Stephanie, specifically to what you just said, for those in the audience who know about the work that the Weikert Center did with the Susan Crown Exchange, that's essentially what we did. We said, how do you really come into some exemplary youth organizations, have them deconstruct what they do, really understand what the connection is between what the staff practices are, and have them really describe the youth experience that they want to get out of that staff practice, linked to the social emotional growth area that you want them to see. And then the assessment tool, the observation tool that the staff used on social emotional, yes, it was to make sure young people were growing, but it was mostly to make sure the feedback to say, are the staff practices doing what we thought? Right. And the safest way to use assessment tools is to say, how do they reflect back to make sure the adult practices that we're doing to create youth experiences are actually getting the results that we expect it to? So with that, I know we could have talked for a much longer period of time, but I'm going to ask you to thank Stephanie and Keith for joining us this morning. They've been great. All right. And then we have Don't Start to Leave Yet. Don't start to leave yet, because the famous Monica is about to come up and talk to us about what we're going to do.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Marie Jones, and I'm a field consultant for the David P. Weikert Center for Youth Program Quality. And I am standing here this morning to invite all of you to take a stand for our youth. Today is the day of the National School Walkout, where youth will be implementing all of these social and emotional learning skills and positive youth development skills that we've been equipping them with to take a stand and to march for their lives. Yesterday, Ruby Sales reminded us that our youth are searching for roots, and she reminded us that they don't have the same community we had growing up. And the young person that we heard from yesterday, Sam, who experienced this personally, reminded us that she feels that people don't care and that being indifferent is standing on the side of the oppressor. So today, we have the opportunity to show our youth that even though we can't be there, and I know that some of us wanted to, I talked to colleagues who said, I don't know if I can come to this national meeting because I want to be next to my youth. We have a tangible and concrete opportunity for you right now to show them that as they walk out of their schools, tens of thousands of youth have organized to walk out of their schools at 10 a.m. today to march for their lives, that we stand with them and we stand with that right for them to have a voice, to say enough is enough. Thank you. So with that, on your tables or under your chairs in the back, if you feel so moved, in a moment, we invite you to stand and turn to our cameras, both video and stationary cameras, and let's share this message with the world and with our youth and let them know that even though we can't be there physically with them today, that we stand and we say enough is enough. So stand and turn toward that camera, and if you feel so moved and if you feel comfortable, let's stand and hold these signs high for our youth.
And when our children tell their story, they'll tell the story of tonight. They'll tell the story of tonight.
Have you ever felt like nobody was there? Have you ever felt forgotten in the middle of nowhere? Have you ever felt like you could disappear? Like you could fall and no one would hear?
Well, let that lonely feeling wash away.
All we see is light.
'Cause maybe there's a reason to believe you'll be okay. 'Cause when you don't feel strong enough to stand, you can reach out your hand and hold.
Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away. No matter what they tell you,
someone will come running to take you home.
Raise a glass to all of us. Tomorrow there'll be more of us, telling the story of tonight.
Out of the shadows, the morning is breaking, and all is new.
It's only a matter of time. Even when the dark comes crashing through,
When you need a friend to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found.
so let the sun come streaming in, 'cause you'll reach up and you'll rise again.
If you only look around, you will be found.
And when our children tell their story,
You will be found.